Bonjour. Thank you so much to DePOT and the University of Lorraine for having me. It is an honor to be here. I hail from Youngstown, Ohio, USA, and it is the subject of my work. Specifically, I focus on a neighborhood called Monkey's Nest, long a site of industrial migration that was demolished for a freeway in 1964. My aim is to document the history in GIS and to argue that it was a critical place within the global network of coerced migration that served racial capitalism, which I will call kinetics. Through kinetic analysis, we learned that spatial organization and community identity emerged from the conflict between workers, elites, and the state. The nest's creation and destruction was entwined with transportation, periodized in 4 eras of mobility: river, canal, railroad, and freeway, which correspond with specific migrations and industries. Looking at Monkey's Nest in this way frames community within the place and movement of racial capitalism and the resistance to it. In addition to providing insights to the history, it explains the lead up to deindustrialization and the politics of our time, as well as posits a future of either further precarity or transcendence. This uncovers the significance in considering transportation not teleologically, but socially constructed, along with the subjectivities such as class, race, and gender. Place and movement are flip sides of the same coin that is kinetics, which shapes society, especially the lives of laborers and their relationship to capital. The history shows pitfalls as well as strategies in reclaiming place and mobility. As constitutive elements of humanity, their co-option and transformation by racial capitalism is central to history, along with the resistance to it. Kinetics are the terrain of exploitation and liberatory struggle. The Monkey's Nest was less than a mile upstream from downtown Youngstown on the Mahoning River at a bend framed by transportation networks. It was site to waves of migrants both brought in and displaced by the global domination of racial capitalism. The colloquial moniker Monkey's Nest came from an Irish-American saloon in 1898 owned by John Galilei. He came to Youngstown to work in the iron mills, then purchased a saloon on Bridge Street. However, bar ownership quickly led to severe alcohol abuse. The local newspaper covered the multi-month bender culminating in his death, ran over by a locomotive on the railroad tracks behind the bar. In referring to both the saloon and the area as Monkey's Nest, it is unknown whether it was the newspaper or Galilei who originated the name, but it was adopted for the whole neighborhood. It often took on racist tones by outsiders, but also was embraced by many of its residents throughout its history. As one of the last residents was quoted, "I'm from the nest, don't take no mess, you grab my chest, you get the rest." Rooted in coerced mobility and an establishing place, it was a site of intense conflict between the workers, elite, and the state. From petty crime to class warfare, it made the nest a raucous place, which a study in 1933 found to be the toughest spot in the Midwest. In each period, people coming to or displaced from the nest took root, found solidarity, though often a solidarity distorted by racism, and demanded a right to place. By spanning indigenous land dispossession to a deindustrialized, racially and politically bifurcated Youngstown of today, this work aims to make sense of the continuity of racial capitalism. Through conflict, power structures transformed to maintain hegemony, but so too did the meaning of place created by residents, however transient. River and foot transportation were the means of mobility prior to capitalist conquest. This site was significant in the Mississippi watershed between present-day Pittsburgh and east of the Cuyahoga River leading to Cleveland. The river bend was critical in indigenous peoples' movement as a junction of the river trail and a direct route to the Salt Springs, basis for the Algonquin name Mahoning. The co-option of those networks was essential to colonization, and thus the site's conversion from place to property. British claims to the land conflicting with France's led to the 7 Years' War in 1754, precipitating the American Revolution. The groundwork for whites' violent removal of indigenous peoples in this stretch of communities, then known as Kuskuski, began during the Revolutionary War. Following independence, it was one of the Army's first military actions. Though not empowered by their communities to do so, representatives from not all the indigenous peoples of the region signed a treaty they could not refuse at Fort McIntosh in 1785, giving up the land. The consequences of this treaty, which the indigenous peoples of Ohio deemed illegitimate, directly led to their Northwest Confederacy, which mounted fierce resistance before surrendering at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. Beyond the ideal of an expanding nation of white Jeffersonian yeomen, this was a capitalist process pushed by real estate speculation. The state of Connecticut's land claim to Northeast Ohio was honored by the U.S. government. The state sold it to private speculators of the Connecticut Land Company, in turn selling to individuals such as John Young the land that would bear his name. The period of river and foot transportation was replaced by the brief age of the canal network that took shape following the Erie Canal's 1825 opening. The P&O Canal along the Mahoning was a key bridge to unite the Ohio and Erie Canal and the Pennsylvania Canal. Following its 1840 opening, cut through the river bend, one of the first boatloads was full of the area's coal to power Lake Erie steamboats. That same coal would fuel the iron industry in the Nest and adjacently. As yeomen proved an inadequate exploitable workforce for canal digging, coal mining, and iron puddling, a labor force of Welsh, German, and hyper-exploited racialized Irish became necessary. Also, this network had unforeseen political and cultural effects, for instance, its significance in the abolitionist movement. Around the time of Gillooly's demise, an Irish immigrant gained international acclaim as the puddler poet. Michael McGovern lived and worked in the Nest as an iron puddler. His poetry showed his strong unionism, railing against the plutocrats, as well as advocacy for Irish nationalism. In these years, the Irish were becoming more accepted in the racial caste of whiteness. The Irish found their way to more respectable positions in the mills and neighborhoods, with the advent of the streetcar system expanding the residential possibilities from the walkable city. The coal fueling this expansion also stoked the locomotives on the railroads that quickly supplanted the canal, with multiple lines crisscrossing the Monkey's Nest. This industrialized transportation was dependent on a proletariat, many of whom were Irish living in the Nest, who resisted exploitation as seen in the Great Strike of 1877 that spanned the region and nation. Further technological developments in steam engines and steel production enabled the expansion of unskilled workers, brought in on oceanic steamships from even further away in Eastern and Southern Europe. The new immigrants packing into the neighborhoods provided the disposable labor sought, but also created a national identity crisis, leading both to calls for Americanization and for their removal. In the milieu, these workers sought liberation from their exploitation through industrial union and political movements, and for their homelands in nationalist movements. So too was it a hotbed for anti-nationalism, in fact gaining widespread attention with the 1918 Youngstown Dynamite plot by Galleonist anarchists. The Great Steel Strike of 1919 was in many ways a culmination of this era. Violent battles between strikers, police, and company goons centered in the Nest. Analysis by national strike leader William Z. Foster stated that while Youngstown was initially one of the most successful sites, as mill workers were joined by railroad workers, a key part to its demise were the corporation's importation of Southern African Americans as strikebreakers, often without their informed consent of their use as such. They were ostracized and attacked by the striking workers, both as scabs and racially. The continuation of this labor recruitment increased with immigration restrictions, combined with the push factors of the Jim Crow South, leading to the Great Migration. Relegated to the worst jobs, along with being barred from entry to many other neighborhoods, further in-migration led to a black majority in the Nest by the Second World War. African Americans transformed the place through their culture, and in their activism to resist the racism which pervaded the city. Organizations such as the NAACP, the UNIA, and the Communist Party were prominent in the local movements with the ideas and tactics of decolonization front and center. A letter from Youngstown activists to W.E.B. Du Bois in 1925 asked if perhaps they should use Mahatma Gandhian tactics to fight for integration. The crisis of racial capitalism became more pronounced in the Great Depression. New Deal reforms sought to preserve and redefine the hegemony of liberalism. In addition to the bargain with labor in legalizing industrial unions, the program was transformative for transportation and housing policy. On one hand, these policies seem progressive: public housing, modern infrastructure, and a plan for superhighways. Yet from their inception, they contained the logic of racial capitalism, and the Nest was a central site to it. In 1937, a large portion of the neighborhood was demolished for one of the first federal housing projects, Westlake Terrace. Madison Avenue served as the dividing line for a black-white segregation in the complex. Beyond this immediate reorganization, the larger housing policies had even more far-reaching effects. The quasi-governmental and real estate industry Home Owners Loan Corporation officially defined racialized spaces. Their redlining maps not only were key to demarcating the white neighborhoods approved for federally backed mortgages, but also the black and marginalized spaces, such as Monkey's Nest, that would be blocked from investment. The 1949 Housing Act went even further, providing funds for their demolition in urban renewal projects that did not require replacement housing for the displaced. The last piece of the puzzle to provide for the demolition of neighborhoods like the Nest, while connecting suburbia to the central business district, was the federally funded freeway boom. The plan to cut 2 expressways through the river bend was met with resistance. A 1958 pamphlet called Challenge to Youngstown, sponsored by a number of community groups, opposed the plan and warned that slum removal, without increased housing and ending racist policies, would only spread problems. Residents on Wirt Street, one of the few sections of greater black ownership in the Nest, mounted a campaign to reverse the decision to take their properties. This would bring a swift counter by city government and the local business community. The city engineer sought to delegitimize opposition, stating, "Wirt Street would never be a preferred residential area, with or without the improvement." City officials were more concerned with the mental well-being of highway engineers than the residents. Quote, "The psychological effect of blocking the expressway would cause the state highway department to feel we are not supporting the projects, and it will also make it more difficult to negotiate with the various property owners who will be affected." End quote. The Madison Avenue Expressway, surrounded by a new light industrial park, cut through the river bend, demolishing the rest of the neighborhood for the freeway to create a ring around the CBD. Perpendicular to it, Federal Street, dividing Westlake Terrace from the rest of the area, was widened into an expressway. Thus, the last residential space were the projects, with diminishing state commitment, walled in by freeways. Failing the challenge to Youngstown resulted in urban rebellions, such as in 1967 and after Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968. The shifting policies of racial capitalism necessitated the Monkey's Nest destruction in the order's vulnerability of densely packed marginalized workers so close to the mills and in downtown. Their revolutionary potential seen in strikes would most certainly have been pronounced in deindustrialization. When Youngstown steel mills closed in the late 1970s and 80s, workers did resist, but were far more decentralized and segregated. Workers in the community made an effort to obtain and operate the mills. In the court case argued by Stott and Lind, the judge even suggested that an industry so essential to a community may have a right to labor, before rejecting that argument. In the absence of capital and effective support from the state, Youngstown was largely left with often useless and counterproductive neoliberal pittances. More importantly, however, it maintained its own grit in surviving. In the years to come, the devastation of deindustrialized racial capitalism expanded, and the city of Youngstown may be said to have become the Nest, in polarization with the surrounding suburbs. Like Monkey's Nest, the city became a place shunned by elites and outsiders. But as with the phrase, "From the nest, don't take no mess," Youngstown persists. Kinetics are still front and center, essential to either greater precarity or revitalization. One of the many fronts toward a sustainable city is broadening mobility from automobile centricity. In addition to interurban public transit, a hike and bike trail cutting through the river bend, following the old canal route to unite with existing trails, is needed. As opposed to the logic of modernity and capitalist transportation, this can be a postmodern and decolonial project, reclaiming a rootedness in nature found in the indigenous trails, but also co-opting the tools of capitalism like many of the previous area's struggles. As a metaform of transportation, this trail can be a site for historical interpretation, documenting the significance of the corridor and the people who made it. Also on the website, under the Mahoning Movement tab, is work I've done toward that. Thank you.